Hello, my name is Martin Nield and I'm going to talk to you today about authentic model railway operation. As we all know, making models to fine-scale standards is very satisfying, but operating a layout in a prototype fashion creates an extra dimension to the hobby. In this talk I'm going to explain the steps I suggest modelers should take if they want to operate their layouts authentically. These are my suggestions for a very enjoyable way to get more out of your hobby. I have been fascinated by railway operation ever since my train spotting days in and around Preston in the 1960s. I quickly got tired of writing down numbers and started to wonder where all these trains were coming from, where they were going to, why certain engines pull certain trains, and what all the signals meant. Since then it's become my main interest in this hobby. I enjoy making models, but I see it as a means to an end. I'm more interested in complete layouts and their operation than individual models, and I've tried to create layouts which operate like the real thing. After all, the Scaleforum Society slogan is "Getting it all right." My main interest is in the traditional steam railway from the 1880s to 1968. I'm not interested in modelling the modern scene, although many of the things I have to say are equally applicable to modern image layouts. And this photograph, by the way, is of my good friend John Thompson's excellent layout, Lowburn Park. My main message today is that authentic operation is fun. Railway modelling is a hobby, not a job. It should be enjoyable, and operating a layout to a timetable with fully working signals is a lot more fun than just playing trains. Over recent years, I think there's been too much emphasis on making really superb models and not enough on how they actually worked. After all, railways existed to shift goods and people from A to B, and we need to try and capture something of that spirit in our layouts. I've lost count of the number of people who've operated my layout for the first time and been delighted with the experience of doing things in a railway-like manner. Knowledge of the steam era operation is unfortunately fading, and it's important that we try to record it. The best way of recreating the steam railway, as Bob Essery says, is through modelling. In normal times, I go to a lot of model railway exhibitions, and all too often I see layouts which are badly designed and operated. There are sidings in daft places, and operation is apparently random. There are automatic couplings that don't work, carriages get propelled without being coupled to a locomotive, and above all, a lack of working signals, or signals that do work, but then get ignored. If you're interested in operating your layout more authentically, then there are several publications available which can help you. Bob Essery has written a series of 5 excellent books, and there are now numerous books about signalling, and information can be obtained from line societies, no matter which era you model, from the HMRS, from the National Railway Museum, and from the National Archives at Kew. And this photograph, by the way, is of a 00 layout called Cold Wood, which, although it's 00, is a superb example of Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway modelling. So what are the essential ingredients I think you need if you want to operate your layout authentically? Well, I think they are as follows. You need to have a convincing story, a realistic track plan, working signals, a timetable or a sequence, authentic train formations, and you need to try and replicate real operations. In addition, if you're building a layout for an exhibition, you need to think about how to entertain and perhaps educate the public. I'm going to go into more detail about each of these elements in the following slides. And the picture shows a engine and brake van arriving on my layout Eccleston to collect its train. Having a convincing story is easy if you're modelling a real location, of course. But if you're modelling an imaginary location, you'll need to do some creative thinking. And either way involves some research. You need to develop the history of your railway line and to understand the geography of the area. And you also need to understand the economy of the area, and all this information will help you to design a realistic track plan and to plan the signalling and the train services. Here is the supposed location of my Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway branch terminus, Eccleston. All the lines on this map really did exist, apart from the Eccleston branch and the Croston sidings at the junction of the branch with the main line from Preston to Liverpool, which you can see in the bottom left-hand corner of the map. When I was planning my layout, I researched the railway history of the area, I read about the history of Eccleston and the industries it had, and I got hold of some of the working timetables for the area to give me an idea of the sort of services which the branch would have seen. All this contributed to the story behind the line, which helped me work out how to operate the layout more authentically. Again, if you're modelling a real location, it's easy to have a realistic track plan, although it may need some compression. But if you're modelling a fictitious line, you'll need to do some research. Real railway companies didn't design track plans on the back of an envelope in the pub, as so many modellers do. They designed them to meet anticipated traffic requirements of the location, and they changed them from time to time. Some stations were too small and had to be expanded to cope with traffic. Others were too ambitious and never had the traffic to justify the investment. The designers of track plans also took into account the topography of the chosen site. You need to study your chosen railway company, as many had characteristic track plans. Perhaps the most famous example is the Midland Railway's Settle to Carlisle line, which only had one facing point in its whole 72-mile route. Another example would be the North Eastern Railway, which had some very complex track plans that used raised coal drops, as it didn't use private owner wagons, but its own hopper wagons to carry coal. If you can identify these characteristics, it will help you create a convincing track plan. And you can use key elements from different locations in the process. This is a photograph which shows the approaches to Liverpool Exchange Station, Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway in pre-grouping days, and as you can see, it's got some of the pioneering electrification. To illustrate what I mean, I'm going to show you 3 examples of typical Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway track plans, and then show how I used those elements to create a track plan for my layout. This is Rishworth, and as you can see, it was double track, as most L&Y branches were, as they had to cope with significant amounts of goods traffic. Despite this, it only had one platform face and had 2 separate types of goods facilities. Above the platform, so to speak, in the drawing, were 2 coal sidings, while the general goods yard was below. Incidentally, there was no head shunt, and that's why there are so many trap points in the goods yard. Next is Home Firth, which is similar, but different. This time there is a piece shed, and that means piece of cloth, by the way, above the platform, while the coal and goods facilities were below. It also had a turntable at the end of the platform and a head shunt. And finally, here is Horwich, which served the town where the famous L&Y locomotive works were located. This has all the key elements: double track with a single platform face, separate goods and coal yards, but with the addition of private sidings running in the opposite direction of the head shunt. Incidentally, you may note with all 3 of these that unlike, say, your typical Great Western or Southern branch terminus, there's no engine shed and there are no carriage sidings, as the L&Y preferred to locate these at its major traffic centres. I wanted to design a typical L&Y branch terminus track plan, and so I came up with something which combined the typical elements of all the 3 above, and here it is. As you can see, it's got double track, a single platform face, separate goods and coal yards, a head shunt, and, the idea pinched from Horwich, 2 private sidings facing in the other direction. So there's an example of how to create what I think is a fairly typical branch line terminus, and I hope it's given you some food for thought about how you could design your own track plans. Next, I want to consider working signals. This fascinating photograph shows the excursion platforms at Blackpool Talbot Road, which is now known as Blackpool North, in L&Y days, and it features lots of wonderful signals, several locomotives, and steam everywhere. It must have been glorious. Virtually all railway lines were signalled for safety reasons. There were exceptions, but generally speaking they were goods-only minor lines. It was a legal requirement that any lines that carried passenger traffic had to be properly signalled. And so I believe that virtually all model railways, unless they are models of goods-only lines obviously, should have working signals. They should not be considered as an afterthought, like telegraph poles, but designed and built in from the start. They're not difficult to model and be made to work. There are several kits available from well-known companies, and parts for others are available from Model Signal Engineering. They also add company identification to a layout. Great Western signals were very different to Caledonian signals, for example, and adding them to your layout helps to give it its identity. They also add to the pleasure of operating the layout authentically, and if you exhibit your layout, they help the audience to anticipate what's going to happen next. You can add levels of complexity, such as interlocking, bells and block instruments if you wish, but this is not essential. Although having said that, I have found that interlocking reduces operator error considerably, and using bells and block instruments reduces the need for operators to shout at each other behind the layout. As I said in the introduction, there are numerous books available now on signalling, and another good source of information is the Signalling Record Society. Here is the signalling diagram for my layout, which shows the points and signals operated by the lever frame, and those points which would have been hand operated. For those people who know my layout, the gasworks beyond the bridge exists only in my imagination. Moving on, we need to have a look at devising a timetable for a sequence for your layout. And here's a simple example of a real working timetable relating to the Horwich branch. Real railways didn't run services at random, they were planned. Passenger services obviously ran to the public timetable, but goods services also ran at times determined in the working timetable. All operating staff, such as signalmen, had copies of the working timetable, the appendix to the working timetable, and special traffic notices. Operating a layout to a timetable removes the random element. I've often stood in front of a layout at an exhibition and heard one operator say to another, "Let's have a goods train. We haven't had one of those for a while." That's not how the real railway works. It's also another factor, along with bells and block instruments, which reduce the need for operators to shout at each other. It gives operation a purpose. When a passenger train departs from your station, you can think of it as the 12:17 to Manchester, or wherever you wish your chosen destination to be. And it also creates teamwork between operators. Everybody knows what everybody else is doing, or at least they should do. Timetables and sequences are both interesting and challenging to compile. I use bits of paper to represent locomotives, sets of carriages, goods breakbands, etc., and I move them around on a table to represent each move and then get things back to where they started. However, I'm sure there are clever computer programs which can do the same thing. And information about timetables is increasingly available from line societies, the National Railway Museum, the National Archives, etc. This slide shows the first page of the sequence I use, and as you can see, it's divided into 3 columns. The first describes the train in prototype terms, the second explains what the fiddle yard operator should be doing, and the third what the station operator should be doing. So just to talk you briefly through the first move, the first train is a through goods from Lostock Hall to Eccleston, and it conveys empty Lancashire and Yorkshire merchandise wagons and loaded mineral wagons. The fiddle yard operator offers the goods train to Eccleston, and if he can accept it, he does, drives the train to the home signal, and then to the platform where he runs round and starts shunting. Meanwhile, the fiddle yard operator is preparing the passenger train in that sequence for the next move, etc. Obviously, this is just how I do it for a branch terminus, and more complex layouts would need a more complex approach. This is a Baltic tank, by the way, leaving Blackpool Central with an express passenger train in early LMS days. And for those people who are interested, on the right-hand side there you can see Blackpool Central Locomotive Depot, with what looks like an ex-LNWR locomotive. The LNWR and the LNY both ran trains into Blackpool. Trains were not a random collection of vehicles, they were planned. Passenger trains were assembled according to a carriage marshalling book to ensure sufficient accommodation was provided for each class. Through carriages were frequently run between different locations, and indeed between different railway companies. And specialised railway vehicles such as restaurant cars, sleeping carriages and parcels vans needed to be catered for. Even the simplest one-carriage branch train needed a brake vehicle and to provide accommodation for the guard. Goods trains were divided into different classes, fully fitted, partially fitted, unfitted, etc. And different types of trains required different locomotives, had restrictions on speed and the number of wagons which were set out in the appendix to the working timetable. Goods trains were also assembled in sections, defined in the classification of goods trains booklet, so that each section could be detached at the appropriate destination. Fitted and unfitted wagons for the same location were often marshalled in different parts of the train. If you take some time to research and understand all this, and in particular the rules and regulations which apply to traffic on your layout, then it will help you to get things right, and also add to the pleasure of working the layout authentically. The photograph, by the way, shows a Lancashire and Yorkshire 080 pulling what's called a right-of-way goods. That was a particular classification the L&Y had for very important trains, and these right-of-way goods took precedence over stopping passenger trains. And you can see it's a right-of-way goods because of the double lamp bracket immediately in front of the chimney. Here's a photograph of the Barton Wright 060 running around its train at Oxenhope on the Keighley-Mearth Valley Railway, which I'm sure many of you have visited. If we are to operate our layouts in a railway-like manner, we need to replicate real operations. So let's take running round as an example. If you go to a preserved steam railway like this one and watch a loco run round its train, then you'll see that it all takes a lot longer than you might think. First of all, the fireman has to get between the loco and the first carriage, disconnect the vacuum brake hose, and unscrew the screw coupling before lifting it off the hook. Then the loco can move forward and the fireman or signalman can change the points. And the loco can run round its train. It may also pause to take water. At the other end of the loop, the reverse has to happen. The fireman or signalman has to change the points, the loco has to buffer up to the stock, the fireman has to get between the loco and carriage and couple them together, tighten up the screw coupling, and connect the vacuum pipe. And then before the train can move, the driver and guard have to perform a vacuum brake test. We can't replicate some of these things on a model railway, but we can indicate what is happening by operating our trains at scale speeds and using pauses to replicate actions. Now to the controversial bit. I suggest using 3-link or screw couplings rather than automatic ones. Using such couplings forces operators to replicate real operations to some extent, but also to introduce those pauses I was talking about. I know some modelers like to use automatic couplings for various reasons, but if you do, please try and pause between moves. Running around at a branch terminus like the one I've described might be authorized by hand signals, but at a more complex location, fixed signals would have been used, and if you have them on your layout, it greatly enhances operation if you use them to authorize moves. Please remember also that steam engines needed water at regular intervals and coaling from time to time. So if you can build such moves into your sequence, it enhances authenticity. Also in steam days, there were lots of light engine and brake van, and empty stock moves. Introducing these into your sequence will help to give it a more authentic feel. Another thing which is worth considering is to use a wagon movement system to give shunting a purpose. Peter Denny used a colour-coded system for his wagon movements on Buckingham, or alternatively you could perhaps adapt the American waybill system to give each wagon an imagined load and destination. This photograph, by the way, shows the end of the bay platforms at Rochdale in the 1960s with a tank locomotive which has just taken water. Exhibition operation. Wouldn't it be nice if we could all go to a show? I hope we can all do that again in the future, but at the moment it's impossible to say when that might be. If you take your layouts to exhibitions, it could be argued that it's even more important to operate it in a railway-like manner, to demonstrate to the public how the traditional steam railway actually worked. I'm sorry about the poor quality of this photograph, by the way, but it was taken in a hurry at the Nottingham show several years ago and shows Ian Fuses operating his short-lived model of Fort William. At exhibitions, it is important to keep things running, because if you don't, the public will walk away. But you can still operate in an authentic manner. Exhibition layouts should be authentic, but also entertaining and informative. It helps if you use a timetable or sequence to display that to the public in some way. This is something I've yet to find a way to do with my layout. And here is my layout, by the way, at the Newcastle show some years ago. So finally, in conclusion, authentic operation is fun. It adds an extra dimension to the hobby. Information is available, and please give it a try. Finally, I hope you will forgive a shameless plug. But if you'd like to know more about any of the aspects of the things I've mentioned, I have written a book about authentic operation, and it's available from the usual railway booksellers. And I will be available on the day of the virtual Scaleforum to answer questions and have a chat with anybody who is interested. Thank you very much and goodbye.